Anti-capitalist demos have caused some of the worst riots in recent years. In this episode, we look at what happens when people take to the streets and attack the very foundations of Western civilization.
I just got shot in the fucking leg with a plastic bullet.
The anti-capitalists are a loose collective of activist groups who believe that the world isn't run by elected governments, but by the leaders of huge multinational corporations with responsibilities only to their shareholders. Whenever world leaders have met to discuss economic issues, protesters have turned out in force to voice their dissatisfaction. And almost always, some kind of confrontation between the authorities and the protesters has taken place. The anti-capitalist movement first came to prominence here, in the heart of the city of London, in the summer of 1999, when a demonstration turned into a full-scale riot. At midday on Friday, June the 18th, protesters gathered at Liverpool Street Station, turning the concourse into one giant carnival. John Jordan of Reclaim the Streets was one of the organisers of this carnival against capitalism.
The idea was really to bring diverse groups from around the world to do actions against capitalism on the day of the G8 summit. Real change comes through taking direct action, which means doing it yourself, which means taking control of your own lives and your own communities yourself without the intermediary of politicians or bureaucrats. Traditionally, with Reclaim the Streets protests, what we would do is we would have a place which would be advertised on leaflets or on email, which was the meeting point. People would go to that space and then they would go into the tube system and then they would come out by surprise, taking the police by surprise and so on.
This time they took it further by distributing thousands of different coloured masks, each with instructions on where to go in the city. At 1 o'clock, thousands left Liverpool Street, heading for their target destinations. This tactic completely wrong-footed the police.
They're very aware of police tactics and they're very good at keeping one step ahead of the police.
A cycling protest had already blocked traffic into the square mile, adding to the police's logistical problems. It wasn't just the police who'd been caught out, so had the press. One of the few cameras at the protest that day belonged to amateur filmmaker Ben Moore.
I don't think anyone knew just how chaotic everything was going to get. In that area of London, there's not a big open space, it's a lot of small streets, alleyways. For the police, that's quite difficult to keep on top of.
This was a new kind of protest. It wasn't a traditional march with banner waving. It was about temporary ownership of a physical space.
You create the space in which people can kind of themselves make something different of that space. The traffic stops and there's a kind of momentary pause in life and people get the opportunity to kind of invest that space with things that they want to do. People wandering through the crowd with 3 CDs that, you know what I mean, you can pick up anywhere for internet access, and we're reflecting the sun back into the police cameras because we could see where the police were kind of stationed filming. Yeah. There was ladders, CCTV cameras were covered. There was a whole series of different things, again, which allowed people to make the most of the space.
But the aim of this demo wasn't just to liberate a space and allow a few crusties to dance badly in the streets. It was to attack the evils of capitalism. With the police confused and under-resourced, hardcore agitators used the carnival as cover to carry out an audacious plan, bricking up the London International Financial Futures Exchange.
We built this wall, which was a beautiful statement of the fact that this was a redundant building, a redundant institution in the future that we really were demanding and calling for.
As a symbol of global capitalism, the Liffey, as it's known, is about as big as it gets. It's a trading floor that at the time had a turnover of £16 billion per day.
For one day, you shut something down. And it's very powerful because subsequently we've got emails from all around the world of people who heard of that, knew what that stood for, that trading floor, and came out and celebrated.
The city police had lost control, and the hardcore, having stopped the Liffey building from trading, now went on a spree of violence.
In that sort of atmosphere, I think people forget about those sort of basic rules and feel that now's the time when they can do anything they want. And this was their moment when there was no law. It was absolute freedom in a way.
As the violence continued, some of the city boys injected some humour into proceedings by photocopying £50 notes and floating them out of the offices onto the heads of the demonstrators. I think if they had any real bottle, they used real 50s, but that's by the by. At that point, the rioters didn't care, because it was their moment. By mid-afternoon, protesters were running riot all over the city, and the police simply didn't know what to do.
Police communication system completely collapsed at this point as all the crowd started to split.
The City of London Police did not have the number of resources to deal with that particular number and that particular ferocity of violence. And the Metropolitan Police, who did have experience, who had the numbers on reserve, were a little bit reticent about going into the City of London's police area.
By Friday evening, the police were on top of the situation, but for a few hours they'd lost control and anarchy had reigned in the city. Their inability to police the situation was highlighted in their own internal investigation.
They always used divide and rule to manipulate any kind of opposition, and in a funny kind of way we were using divide and rule here, because in fact we ruled the day because they themselves were divided by this inability to coordinate on the day.
The rioters caused over £2 million worth of damage to property. But John Jordan sees the damage as belonging to a noble tradition of protest.
Well, for me, violence is hurting living things. It's what happens every day in the financial district, every day, every time. Every time another forest is cut down, the shares go up. Breaking a glass door isn't a violent act if no one's hurt. Again, that's a long, long, long tradition from the suffragettes running down Regent Street in their Victorian dresses, smashing the windows with little hammers. It's been happening for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it really is nothing to be that surprised by, really.
The Stop the City riots have put the role of free market capitalism and third world debt firmly on the map. The rioters had made their point. And as for the authorities, the government and the police, they were totally wrong-footed by the ferocity and impact the protests had had. And it wasn't long before they were facing another potential riot situation here at Euston Station. In November 1999, Reclaim the Streets arranged another demo. This time, protesters convened at the start of the evening commuter rush hour. Fearful of being outwitted by another well-organised and destructive anti-capitalist protest, the police took no chances.
The police did learn the lessons from the earlier incident and were far more forceful in their tactics of policing the demonstrators. They were actually proactive as opposed to reactive.
Police tactics were to contain the protest within the immediate area around Euston Station, thus preventing groups of radical anarchists from breaking out and wreaking havoc across London.
But the police tactics that day were modelled on German police tactics, which is essentially you enclose the whole area with police, then you gradually move inwards so that you're concentrating the crowd, and therefore, in theory, the crowd can't cause any trouble.
But the problem is, when you compress a crowd, you make it angry.
The confined space that things happen in is a big catalyst to making violence happen. I don't think I've ever seen violence when there hasn't been some sort of physical fencing or physical constraint around the demonstration. As a policing tactic, all it does is raise the stakes and injure people, both policemen and demonstrators.
The crowd become fearful, and then fear leads to aggression. Then if you have a whole load of police who are basically pushing you into an ever smaller space, it's human nature to push back against that. There's probably only 50 people who wanted to cause trouble, but the situation was such that it just exploded.
As the violence escalated, the police made repeated charges into the crowd. James Foster, who was there with his video camera, got caught in the eye of the storm.
They've run at us, and we're kind of not expecting it. I find myself thrown in with press photographers and a real mishmash of people. One of them's come steaming up to me with a baton, and I've been hit round the head, and I've dropped the camera, picked it up, and I've had to leg it into the park next to where all this is going on, because if you were in the way, you were going to get hit. The methods that were used are incredibly heavy-handed.
The police actually attacked the press corps on that evening. One of them ran towards me at high speed with his truncheon raised and tried to hit me over the head. I blocked it with my arm, and the truncheon hit my elbow, and the elbow just shattered.
With the crowd penned in and not allowed to leave, some protesters vented their anger on a police van that had been left within the cordon.
Police were very cross about that because they had all their personal gear on it. You know, their civilian clothes, I guess, and their, I don't know what, newspapers, magazines, sandwiches, and all that went up in flames, and they were very cross about that.
By midnight, the violence had died down, but the police continued to keep the crowd contained, only allowing them to leave one at a time.
And you had to wait your turn to be processed through this alleyway which they'd set up, which had a photo booth, so they'd take your photograph, they'd take your name and address, they'd make sure that you were exactly who you were and why you were there and what you were about. And I suppose if you get spotted again at something like that, then you're a habitual offender and you'll be one of the ones that get picked out.
After their perceived humiliation at the Stop the City riot, the police had got their revenge. From now on, British police would counter these anti-capitalist events with increasing shows of strength, sophistication and aggression.
No matter what people say about police brutality in the UK, compared to the cops in America and mainland Europe, ours seem almost subtle in their approach.
After the break, we see how the Americans deal with the anti-capitalist brigade. And it's free chips and burgers as a McDonald's is ransacked at a May Day riot in central London. Coming up, the anti-capitalists go on the rampage as riots kick off in Seattle and London.
The riots of 1999 expose a huge ideological rift within the ranks of the anti-capitalist, anti-globalisation movement. On the one hand, you had those that favoured non-violent direct action, the fluffies. They enjoyed a kind of bringing a sense of fun to the demonstration, dressing up, taunting the police, but never going any further. Then on the other hand, you had the spikies who really just wanted violent, aggressive confrontation. And although vastly outnumbered by the fluffies, at this point, the spikies appeared to be in control.
The next city to experience spiky aggression was Seattle in the United States, when activists from around the world ran amok in what became known as the Battle of Seattle. From early in the morning on November the 30th, 1999, an international brigade of anti-capitalist protesters gathered in Seattle to protest against the World Trade Organization meeting in the city. Activist filmmaker Simon Mitchell managed to follow the action.
You're masked up, you're expecting some trouble, yeah?
I'm hoping for some.
Yeah?
Quite frankly. I mean, these businesses, they're not going to bow to people dancing in the streets. They're not going to bow to people dressed as, you know, giant sea turtles or so on. They care about one thing. They care about capital. And unless we put a dent in their pocket, what good is
How are we going
action?
to do that? How are you going to put a dent in their pocket?
Hopefully by causing property damage.
Well, there you go, Nike getting it. People pissed off with their big corporate controllers. A whole bunch of people trying to protect Nike Town for some reason. But I think it's a bit late. I think they're worried about looting.
As with everything American, this was bigger, louder, and better than anything seen before. This was a supersized riot. It wasn't long before property was getting trashed all over the city, despite the best efforts of locals to stop them.
You're fighting our...
But it didn't take long before the authorities decided to hit back, and hit back hard.
This is your
gone off big time. They try to clear a fucking intersection up there. The police are tear gassing people, they're hitting people with sticks, there's fucking gas everywhere. They really couldn't give a toss, they're laying into people. My face is burning.
A state of emergency was declared in Seattle. All constitutional rights were suspended, giving police and the now mobilised National Guard free rein to arrest and beat whoever they wanted.
I just got shot in the fucking leg with a plastic bullet.
The authorities congratulated themselves on coming down hard on the anti-capitalists, but it was a PR disaster for them, as images of American riot police firing tear gas, pepper spray and plastic bullets at their own citizens turned public opinion against them. The next anti-capitalist protest to cause trouble was May Day 2000. After the events of the previous year, the police set about organising the largest public order operation in over 30 years, drafting in over 5,500 officers. The protest began on the morning of May the 1st with a spot of light gardening in Parliament Square.
The idea was to have a garden party outside Houses of Parliament as a fun day, bring your kiddies, have picnics. It was a day just to say we're not happy with the politicians and the way things are going, and we'd like things to be a bit different. And we all came together under one umbrella, didn't we, in a sense?
I don't think that was the real intention at all. I think they were just looking to cause as much damage as they could, and that was the guise.
Mindful of the criticism the Seattle authorities had received for their heavy-handed tactics, the London police employed a softly approach. But then it all kicked off.
This was the moment when a peaceful protest turned sour. A mob began driving police back in Whitehall, leaving the anti-capitalist protesters a clear run at their targets. McDonald's was damaged outside, ransacked inside.
I was standing in the window next to looking round to get a better view. And there were burgers and chips flying out, and it was quite a sight, really.
The attack on McDonald's forced the police to act. So they brought in the riot squads and employed the same containment tactics that they had used at Euston, this time pinning the crowd in Trafalgar Square.
Back. I was a present for my mum.
I haven't thrown anything. I haven't done my fucking girlfriend. Reasonably. You motherfucker!
And there was a woman there with her child the child got through and she didn't, and she was freaking out. And they just beat her with truncheons. I mean, it was quite heavy-handed, really. And we were just wandering around there for about an hour. I mean, there was bemused, elderly Japanese tourists. There was all sorts in there. Quite a scary experience, really. I've not been to one since, to be honest.
The containment tactics prevented widespread violence, but nevertheless, a few symbols of the establishment did get damaged.
I didn't agree with the paint being sprayed on the War Memorial, and I don't think many other people did. But I did smile when I saw Winston Churchill's green Mohican, because it's a piece of grass, honestly, for heaven's sake.
May Day 2000 was a public relations victory for the Metropolitan Police. They prevented a replay of the Battle of Seattle, where footage of police firing rubber bullets had turned public opinion against the authorities. But the damage to the cenotaph and the Churchill statue did upset them. The following year, they were determined not to let the protesters do any damage, even if that meant potentially infringing their civil liberties. The May Day 2001 protest was due to meet at midday at Oxford Circus, the heart of London's shopping district. But when protesters turned up, they found riot squads blocking off all four corners of the crossroads. 10,000 people were confined and compressed for up to 5 hours, without access to food, water or toilet facilities.
It did cause some consternation because a lot of people felt that their human rights were being violated, but we've seen from history what their intentions were, and the police prevented major damage in the West End of London.
I had somebody on the right of me, somebody on the left, an old boy who walked out of the square who was just walking his dog, and he was saying to the policeman, please, you know, I live just there. He was like, I've just come out to walk my dog, and the policeman was like, no. And then there's another lady who had her airline tickets, and she was going, look, if I don't get out of here now, then I'm never going to get this plane. And he just looked at the pair of them and went, the only way out of here is if you're bleeding. And that was it. I just looked at him and I went, you serious? He went, oh yeah.
The police tactics totally smothered any demonstration, peaceful or otherwise.
Aren't we allowed to protest nowadays without actually being, you know, having our civil liberties taken away to the fact that we're not allowed to go to the toilet? Or I don't think that's right. I don't think the police should be allowed to do that.
It's a very fine line in allowing lawful protest, allowing people to express their views, but by the same time not allowing people to commit criminal acts. And getting that balance is a fine judgment, but I think in recent years we've got that absolutely right within the police of this country.
The police operation at May Day 2001 was so successful that the anti-capitalists have not staged a major protest in London since. Next time on I Predict a Riot, over 30 years of street violence in Northern Ireland.
And here's how the rest of the week lines up at 10. Tomorrow, Dog the Bounty Hunter goes "Rrrr." Parko PI, the NYC Private Eye, investigates on Thursday, and we go down some rather freaky villain streets with the Night Stalker on Friday.